last week when we ended, the war was over, and Samuel Seabury had just become a bishop. And Kay, can I ask a favor? Can you close that door, please?
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Christine. You're welcome. And Samuel Seabury had just gotten back from England, where he was made a bishop. So Anglicans in the emerging states, because we weren't yet technically states, but Anglicans now had a bishop. It was not a unifying moment.
Can I shoot that shade?
Yeah. Oh, goodness.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I couldn't see you.
Not a problem. I'm the closest one. So, Seabury was not a unifying factor in the life of the church because, as we mentioned last week, there were many who opposed Seabury. And that was because Seabury, in particular, had a high view of the episcopacy, of being a bishop. And he had a limited view of what role laity should play in the life of the church. Seabury wrote to his clergy in the Diocese of Connecticut what his understanding was of a bishop laying on hands. He said that in confirmation, we believe the Holy Spirit to be given for sanctification, for carrying into effect that regeneration which is conferred in baptism. By baptism, we are taken out of our natural state of sin and death, into which we are born by our natural birth, and are translated, transplanted, or born again into the Church of Christ. And by confirmation, we are endued with the Holy Spirit to overcome sin and to perfect our holiness in fear of the Lord. So he really had a strong view that a bishop was not just a leader in a temporal sense, in an administrative sense, but a bishop did exactly what the historic understanding of a bishop was, and that is a bishop is a witness to the resurrection. And so for Seabury, being a bishop, having bishops was of major importance. In that sense, and if you listened carefully to some of the stuff I said, he sounded a little bit like the guys who came out of the Great Awakening in terms of his understanding of what was going on, for example, in the rite of confirmation. On the other hand, he made it really clear that this was not about adult baptism. This is what happens in general. So from the time a child is born, they are in need of this moment of grace in front of the bishop. Now, brief sidebar here. You remember I mentioned at the time of the Great Awakening that in England, among its leaders were John and Charles Wesley. And in the 1750s, they came to the colonies and established the last of the original 13, which if you remember from your map, actually your map didn't tell you the order they came, but it was Georgia. And they established it as a penal colony, okay? Now, the Anglicans who were active in the States, Anglicans were active in the Methodist societies that existed, and they were very concerned about a need for organization within the denominations in the former colonies. What little organization Methodists had in the colonies before the war was devastated by the Revolutionary War. In fact, John Wesley was openly opposed to the Revolution. By 1784, most Methodists lived south of the Mason-Dixon line. they were growing rapidly, and they needed clergy. So in that sense, in 1784, they were in almost the same boat as the Anglicans in the colonies. Everybody needed clergy. The Anglicans just added that layer that they needed bishops. In England, Charles Wesley, John Wesley's brother, approached Seabury about ordaining Methodist lay preachers. Now you remember I said last week, Seabury did not have a high regard for the role of laity in the church. But when approached about how Methodists could get more preachers here in the colonies, Seabury initially agreed, provided the candidates were properly qualified. Now, what did that mean? Well, you may remember 2 weeks ago I said Anglican clergy had to have a university degree in England. And so when they came to the States, pre-Revolutionary War, of course, they were an educated group of people. Methodist lay preachers did not initially present with that type of qualification, and so that's why Seabury said that they had to be properly qualified. That didn't go over well south of the Mason-Dixon line. Whether it didn't go over well because it was Seabury advocating it, or whether it didn't go over well because so many itinerant preachers south of the Mason-Dixon line had not been into university, hard to say. But Methodists decided in the former colonies decided that they wanted to have a different route for ordination rather than have an Anglican bishop ordaining lay preachers. In 1783, John Wesley, who had gone back to England, designated a man named Francis Asbury as the general assistant for America. And with Asbury, they sketched out a plan for church governance. Now, I mentioned Asbury's name because some of the names that you will hear over the course of time, you'll say, why do I think I know that name? And that's because many of these early guys, their names come up over and over again as the names of churches, universities, chapels, you name it. Wesley, Asbury, Whitfield, not so much, but there will be other names that come up. And it's exactly that point, that these early leaders working to create some kind of a cohesive church in the former colonies became important parts of Christianity in the post-Revolutionary War world. So Wesley and Asbury sketched a plan for church governance. And it would begin with them revising the Book of Common Prayer to suit their style of prayer and worship. That and don't forget, at this point, the Book of Common Prayer is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. And as a footnote to all of that, you may not know it, but even though we use a lot of material from a prayer book revision in the Church of England from about 10 years ago called Common Worship, the official book of Common Prayer of the Church of England is the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. They attempted a revision of that book in 1928, and Parliament refused to pass it. They attempted a revision in 1980 called the Alternative Services Book and didn't even begin to put it before Parliament because the church in England could not agree that they wanted to present the book to Parliament. When Common Worship came out, it's basically 1662 and Common Worship. They live side by side. In this country, anytime we revise the prayer book, the previous one goes on to the archive shelves. And that's why the Book of Common Prayer today is the 1779, is the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, okay? So Wesley and Asbury reshaped the order of the liturgy for Methodists in North America. And in 1784, they sent lay and clergy leaders to America to support the Methodist Church. Some of those leaders that they sent were ordained Anglican priests who liked the method that the Wesley brothers and Asbury were advocating. Christmas 1784, the Methodists in all the former colonies held an annual conference in Baltimore. They may or may not have known in December of '84 that Seabury was now a bishop because of his ordination in Scotland. November of '84. Colonies wanted to create and secure an organization for Methodists on this side of the pond. So the question before these Methodists in Baltimore was, do we wait for Anglican bishops to rise up in America who would then ordain Methodist clergy? Or do we proceed apart from the Anglicans? Now, I see Kay over there looking at me like, why would that have anything? Well, bear in mind, John and Charles Wesley were Anglican priests. George Whitefield from the Great Awakening in the 1740s and 50s was an Anglican priest.
So they were Anglican starting the other churches in the
Right.
West. Okay.
Exactly. And, you know, there are some people who would argue that neither Wesley renounced well, it's not an argument. Neither Wesley renounced their Anglican orders. So they may have become a Methodist, but technically they were still Church of England priests. And so in that sense, they've got one foot in one camp, one foot in another camp, and they're trying to create this new denomination in the former colonies. So, do we wait for there to be Anglican bishops in America? And how long will that take? Or do we proceed apart from the Anglicans? John Wesley said that if they waited and Anglican bishops ordained Methodist clergy, then those bishops would expect to govern the new clergy. For most Methodists, that was not a pleasing thought, because part of their method was to get away from the hierarchically imposed rule of bishops in England. Part of that rule was ecclesiastical. There was another part of it that was secular, because you remember, bishops in the Church of England sat in the House of Lords. So they had a political as well as an ecclesiastical influence on Christians in England. And so Methodists weren't sure they wanted to bring that combination of things into their life here in the former colonies. And the second thing was, at this point, there was no Episcopal Church in the United States of America. They were still desperately trying to figure out how the Anglicans were going to govern and live in the colonies. I mentioned a minute ago that Anglican bishops ruling Methodist clergy was not a pleasing thought, and the person whom it displeased the most was John Wesley. So the Methodists decided at this December '84 conference to form an Episcopal church, small e, and to have superintendents, elders, and deacons. The Methodist societies, as their little cells had been called, now became the Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, some of you might be able to remember back in the day, 50 60 years ago, any Methodist church would have been the first ME Church of Fitchburg, the first Methodist Episcopal Church of Fitchburg. The Methodist Episcopal was removed at one of their annual conferences in the 60s, if my memory is correct, because they had many offshoots that had been created across the United States, and at one of their annual conferences, all these offshoots decided to come back in to Mama Church, and that's where you get the United Methodist Church. Okay? United Methodist Church, another footnote, does not include the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church. Those are all still totally separate from that umbrella called United Methodism. So, we now have the ME Church, as it was often called, and they decided that their superintendents could ordain elders and deacons. That caused reservations among many existing Methodist clergy because they had been ordained by Anglican bishops. They had gone to university. And now, because they like the new method, they've moved into this new denomination, and now all of a sudden, we're not going to have that hierarchy that they felt so comfortable with. That led to some clergy who had joined the Methodist Episcopal Church to walk down the street to go back and find whatever Anglican church might have been in their hymn. In 1787, which was shortly before he died, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States changed. That's not fair. They added a title above the superintendent, which was bishop. And John Wesley was ripped because in his mind, they were going back away from the new open method and going back into that hierarchical Church of England method. So, this also meant that Methodists were choosing to ordain folks who did not have a university degree. And that was still, in the Church of England, a requirement for Anglican clergy. And that requirement had just carried over into the colonies. Okay? But the difference was, for the Methodists, without that university requirement, it allowed them to tap a larger body of people as candidates for leadership within the church. And it also meant that laity could see a way for them to actually exercise some kind of a sacramental ministry within the Methodist Church, which was not as easy for laity to see in the mid-80s in the Anglican Church. So, mid-80s, the Methodist Episcopal Church in the United States has candidates for ordination. And in the mid-80s, the Congregationalists, the Presbyterians, and the Episcopalians in particular were facing shortages. So, 1780s, well, I have this slightly out of order, but you'll live with me. 1787, the Anglican Church in the United States had basically three factions, for lack of a better word. There was the Mid-Atlantic and the Southern group who had supported the Revolution. There were the Connecticut and New York group who had tended to be loyalists during the Revolution. And then there's good old New England. The New England Anglican clergy doubted the integrity of those from the Mid-Atlantic states and those from the Southern states. They believed that they had surrendered way too much episcopal authority to the laity. Now, you'll remember that I said during the Revolution, the House of Burgesses suspended requirements that a priest presided, this, that, and the other thing. Lady led the services. And
Because
said,
otherwise there would not be any.
well, exactly, and said respectfully, if you allow a group of people to have authority, and then the reason for their having authority ends, and now you want to come back in and you want to pull in the reins, what happens?
Fight back.
You have a bunch of people who want to know why. No good answers, right?
Yeah.
So, in 86 and 87, Anglicans in the former colonies found themselves in one of these factions, and in the middle of it all stands Samuel Seabury as a legally consecrated bishop, okay? But you've got a whole bunch of people within the life of the Anglican Church here in the former colonies who are questioning if they really want Seabury. Because they're not sure that his brand of episcopacy, which is bishop-centered, is going to work in a new republic. Now, I'm talking 86 and 87. What was going on in the history of the former colonies in 86 and 87?
Isn't that the Constitution being...
That is when they began to need to hammer out a constitution for the colonies, to figure out how these 13 colonies that really hadn't had to work together at one level would now figure out how, can we work together? Can we do this? All right? So, not just within the Anglican Church, but within the colonies as a whole, there was a great deal of hostility under the surface. 1786. Back up. 1785, Seabury was back, and Anglicans met for the first time, what amounted to the first General Convention. This was when they were trying to see if they could figure out how they were going to create the Episcopal Church in the United States. I should say the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America.
So now, was this the group of like 3 people or 3 in Pennsylvania area, or is this a bigger one?
Bigger. It had people from most of the colonies, okay? But when I say General Convention, don't think about today where General Convention amounts to about 1,400 people. If they had 140 people, that would have been humongous. I doubt that they had that many. I doubt that they had 100.
Oh, I was just trying to make sure it wasn't that.
It wasn't that small one that I meant. No,
In
no.
the States, only 7 delegates.
Exactly.
Madison, Rhode Island, Connecticut, where he showed up late with 1 delegate each
Or something like that. And Georgia didn't. Georgia wasn't there at all. So.
Well, they're so far south.
Well, and don't laugh. 1785.
That was hard travel.
Hard travel, right? So, they met in 1785 and adjourned and agreed to come back and meet in 1786. That would become the second General Convention, okay? At that convention, the clergy and laity who were there elected William White and Samuel Provost as bishops. Now, William White was the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia. He had been the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia through the war, and what was the person who convened that conference that Christine is referring to that we discussed last week of clergy in Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, okay? Samuel Provost was the Bishop of New York, excuse me. He was the rector of Trinity Wall Street. And he and White were elected as bishops. How many bishops do we have in the former colonies at this point? 1. So they had to go to England and do the same thing that Seabury had done in 83 and 84 to try to see if they could get 3 bishops to ordain them.
Did they end up in Scotland as well?
No. What a difference 2 to 3 years makes, okay? The treaty had been signed in 1783. There was no getting us back. And now, bishops in England were more willing to ordain priests to be bishops in the former colonies than they were when Seabury first went over in 83. In addition, Parliament had passed a law which allowed English bishops to ordain bishops for the church in America. So,
Church in America being either Episcopal or Methodist?
from the Church of England's point of view, they were only going to be ordaining for the Anglican/Episcopal Church.
Okay.
From Parliament's point of view and the Church of England's point of view.
Because the law applied also, it could?
No, I don't believe it does, and here's the reason. The Methodists, undergirding John Wesley's vision, was he didn't want bishops that were tied into the government. And you see, the English bishops were subject to these kinds of laws or non-laws or whatever you want to call them that Parliament might pass or not pass. And the Methodists in the United States did not see that as a way that this country was going to go. We weren't going to have a state church that was going to dictate things. And of course, by the time 1786 came along, the Constitutional Convention, the work of it was beginning, okay? So therefore, they knew that the conversations here were wrapped around separation of church and state. So therefore, the Methodists probably were dancing in the aisles that the governance in this country was going to make that kind of meshing very difficult. Not sure how many of the soon-to-be Episcopal bishops felt about it, but anyway, it turned out in 1787 that the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of York, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells ordained William White and Samuel Provost. In return, there's always haggling. In return, White and Provost agreed not to consecrate bishops in America until 3 bishops had been consecrated by English bishops. You see, think about it, when White and Provost, they're now bishops, when they sail back,
That would be 3 bishops, including Seabury.
there would be 3, except
Seabury was ordained
Was-
in Scotland.
was ordained in Scotland by the non-juring bishops. And remember what we said, they ended up being non-juring because they were mad at Parliament for kicking out James II. Is this a big enough web? Okay, just, you might be saying, why are we going through this? I want us to, as we keep going, and we get into the 20th and 21st century, I want us to recognize that sometimes our behavior today is just a repeat of what we've been doing for years. Okay? And sometimes we can't explain our behavior, so we take a word that we used in one context back in the 1700s, and then in the 1800s, we'll put it into 2 new contexts, and then we'll get to the 1900s, and you'll find people, I'm high church. What does that mean? Well, I believe in the episcopacy. I'm high church. What does that mean? I believe in smells and bells. I'm high church. And the list will go on. And it's grounded in our history. Okay? So, we needed 3 bishops in this country ordained by English bishops. Well, we could have had 3, because a man named David Griffith was elected in Virginia as their bishop-elect, but he couldn't raise the money to go to England with White and provost. So, White and provost come back. We come to 1789. Now, I mentioned 1785 and 86 and said they were the first two general conventions. I know people who say that the first general convention wasn't until 1789, but the bottom line is they were meeting, in essence, as a general convention in 85 and 86. But in 89, General Convention met in Philadelphia. And it had 2 sessions. In the meantime, they're back here in the country, but Provost, who could not stand Seabury, Provost was unable to attend. Now let me back up and say, when I say could not stand, I'm really trying to be polite. Detested, hated his
I
guts.
think they hated one another.
Let me back up and say it was.
Would it come to duels?
Oh, no, that's next week's, oh, we don't have a class. That's 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about duels, all right? But anyway, Provost couldn't come to Philadelphia. So, William White used this opportunity to make concessions to appease Seabury and try to heal this breach. Because since Provost and Seabury couldn't stand each other, you've got 2 bishops in the colony, former colonies, who don't talk to each other, who happen to be side by side, and don't want to have anything to do with each other, which leaves William White out here, in essence, to dry. Because he's got no colleagues, he's got nobody. That's not fair. Provost was willing to work with White, but because he hated Seabury so much, he was oftentimes not thinking straight. All he wanted to do was sort of nail Seabury, okay? So anyway, what White did in 1789, he affirmed the validity of Seabury's consecration. You see, we had 2 bishops ordained by English bishops. So you could have an undercurrent of who gives a hoot about Seabury. Let's just cart him off. But he was the first one ordained, and White wasn't stupid enough to let that be lost. So White affirmed, he got the convention to affirm Seabury's orders. He also created a bicameral governance. Now, where did he get that idea? Where did he get the idea that we would have 2 houses? Down the street. If you're ever in Philadelphia, you can walk from Independence Hall to Christ Church, Philadelphia. Last week I said something like 70% or so of the signers of the Declaration were Anglicans. And they were many of the same people who came back to the Constitutional Convention. And then they just walked down the street to Christ Church, where the soon-to-be Episcopalians were meeting to figure out what the church would look like here in the former colonies. So, many people just wanted one house, one body, everybody together. Seabury, of course, didn't want laity mucking up the works. So White created a bicameral governance. A House of Bishops and a House of Deputies. What does that sound like? A Senate and a House of Representatives.
Confusing.
Yes, confusing. That could be.
Oh, it's even more confusing.
He created a separate House of Bishops which had a partial veto. Partial
What is
veto.
a partial veto?
Well, what it means is if they vetoed something, the House of Deputies could override a veto by the House of Bishops with a 3/5 vote, 60%. So that's why it was a partial veto. House of Deputies could pass something, House of Bishops could say, there is no way in God's green earth that this is ever going to happen, and then if the deputies could get to 60%, that ended the House of Bishops saying.
So it kept the bishops from being overlords and,
Right, right. White also amended the emerging Constitution to make the participation of lay deputies optional. Seabury was opposed to lay involvement in governance. Southern colonies knew nothing but lay involvement in governance. And so, trying to reach a compromise, White said, we'll make the participation of lay deputies optional.
so an individual church could choose option A or option B for governance.
Well, no, what he was, a diocese, in sending their their deputies to general convention, could make a decision that they weren't going to send any lay deputies and they were going to all be clergy for the House of Deputies, okay? So, this is also the time in which White led the church in creating a Book of Common Prayer for the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America. They started with 1662, but Scotland had revised the prayer book, I want to say in the 1750s, 1760s, something like that. And so they pulled in various things from the Scottish revision, and the 1789 prayer book became sort of an amalgamation of 1662 and the Scottish Book of Common Prayer. All of this work that William White did meant that guess who wasn't really happy?
Seabury?
Seabury. His high churchmanship was grounded in a high view of the work of the persons of the Trinity in the life of the church. In other words, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are actively involved in the life of the church. Remember what I said earlier about his comments about confirmation and the ordination and laying on of hands and ordination, and that's imbuing the Spirit. That's what happens in baptism. Very high view of the Trinity in the life of the church, and a very high view of the episcopacy. And in his mind, I think he would dare say, I don't care what the clergy want to do. The bishops are the ones who have to make these decisions. Part of the problem with Seabury's position was it had a royal feel to it. And you remember that he was a loyalist, even though he did not leave and go back to England during the Revolution. So, like I said, there were 2 sessions in 1789. And in the second session, there were more concessions that White was able to make. Originally, the House of Bishops could not originate legislation. Only the House of Deputies could originate legislation. So in the second session, the House of Bishops got the right to originate and therefore act on legislation first. Okay?
So they could now write what want to be presented.
Right, as opposed to waiting for the House of Deputies to write it and then saying, not a chance in hell. The second session created a strong veto for the House of Bishops. In other words, it raised the deputies' ability to veto legislation. They had to now have an 80% majority to veto legislation that the House of, to override a veto that the House of Bishops had imposed. And just looking ahead briefly, in 1808, all of that was taken out, so that the House of Deputies did not have sort of this super veto policy. Seabury decided, all right, maybe I can live with all of this. And so, at the second session, he took his seat in General Convention. And with him came the clergy from Connecticut, the clergy from Rhode Island, the clergy from New Hampshire, the clergy from Massachusetts. That full body is what adopted the 1789 prayer book. That prayer book, I forgot to say a minute ago, it restored the Nicene Creed and, in the Eucharist, and it restored the full text of the Apostles' Creed into morning and evening prayer. In the Nicene Creed, that reference to Christ's descent into hell included an explanation in the footnotes which said that it was a descent to the place of departed spirits. In other words, descending into hell was still somewhat problematic among some of the Episcopalians at this General Convention. The 1789 prayer book referred to priests, but not consistently. When they talked about the preacher, they talked about the preacher. When they talked about the priest, it tended to be in the Eucharist. But in the offices, in morning prayer and evening prayer, they talked about the officiant, preacher, whatever you want to call it, but not the priest. The 1789 prayer book restored the concept of regeneration into the baptismal service. In other words, that salvation is intimately connected to this act of baptism. This goes against the Great Awakening, which was saying that you had to come and make an adult confession. Okay? And the 1789 prayer book ensured that there would be no references to the crown. Because remember, they were borrowing from books that made reference to the governments in England. They also made some changes that were not in the proposed book of Common Prayer. A footnote to that, one of the things that came out of 1785 meeting was a proposed book of Common Prayer, which floated around for about 4 years, okay, before the 1789 prayer book. So in 1789, they decided to pull some of the Psalms out. Now, you know that right now we have 150, we have all 150, well, we have the accepted 150 Psalms. There's 151st Psalm, which most denominations around the globe are not sure was really in Hebrew Scripture. But they shortened the 150. And if my memory is correct, they took out things like, is it 139 where they talk about bashing the babies?
37.
Oh, 137, about where they talk about bashing babies on rock. You know, they took out the ones that, going back to Ben's sermon on Christmas Eve, the God you want, the God you get. Okay? They said that the proper preface for the Feast of the Trinity was optional. In other words, you didn't have to try and explain the Trinity. So, Convention met again 3 years later in 1792, and White tried to work on further compromises. He had to because things had developed between that General Convention in 1789 and the General Convention in 1792. Massachusetts elected a man named Samuel Parker to be their bishop-elect, and they asked White, Provost, and Seabury to consecrate him as Bishop of Massachusetts.
I'm guessing Provost had a big problem with this.
No, White was the one who put his foot down and said that couldn't happen because they needed the permit. In order for the three of them to do that, they would need the permission of the English archbishops, Canterbury and York. Because remember, what had they done in 1786 and 7? They made a promise, you consecrate us, we won't consecrate another bishop for the colonies until we have 3 consecrated by English bishops. Okay? Massachusetts is saying, we want Provost, White, and Seabury. White said, can't do. without permission. So he wrote to England asking for permission. The answer was basically crickets, crickets, crickets. And the fact that they did not respond is not surprising, because you see, for the two archbishops in England to give these three guys in former colonies permission to ordain Parker, to do that would mean that they were actually passing judgment on the validity of the orders of the non-juring bishops. Because what England had maintained from 1688 on was those non-juring bishops no longer had the authority to consecrate. And three of them had consecrated one of the guys over here. And so the fact that there was no answer isn't surprising. Okay? However, before the 1792 General Convention, Virginia elected another man named James Madison, not the president. They elected a man named James Madison in 1790 to be Bishop of Virginia, and he went, this time they raised the money, he went to England. He was ordained by 3 English bishops. So now, he's back in 1792, and now it is possible for White and Provost to honor their promise and yet begin consecrating bishops in this country.
Now, did they use Seabury? Because all the people in England said was there would have to be 3 consecrated bishops.
By English
By
bishops.
English. In the States, they didn't necessarily say they had to be the ones doing the further.
Hang on. Okay. So, in the meantime, Maryland elects a man to be the Bishop of Maryland. He was elected they had elected him back in 1787. But this guy, named William Smith, had a reputation for the consumption of alcohol. And General Convention in 89 and 92 would not endorse his candidacy. In 1792, Maryland gave up on him and they elected a guy to be bishop named Thomas Claggett. So now, White convinced Seabury, Provost, and Madison to join him in consecrating Claggett. Count how many bishops I just said? 4. Claggett, Bishop of Maryland, would become the first American consecrated a bishop in the Episcopal Church on American soil. It also meant that White had gotten the 2 arch enemies together, and he did all of this by arranging for Seabury to be absent from the first few days of convention. In essence, if my memory is correct, he told him convention began on June 3rd, and he started it on June 1st, and he managed to do all of this finagling so that they could get to the point of consecrating, so that Seabury wouldn't be there to say, no, I will not do this with Claggett. Instead, he had him, when he arrived, well, you're going to do this with us, right? What's he going to say? The other thing that Seabury did is, in those first couple of days before Seabury arrived, he appointed Samuel Provost to be the presiding bishop of the first session of the 92 General Convention. That meant that Provost was presiding bishop for 2 or 3 days. All the approval for Claggett went through, Seabury arrives, and the consecration happens. In those days, consecrations happened at General Convention because How are you gonna get 3 or 4 bishops together? It's not like today where they get on a plane, they fly. You gotta get them in the same place. So if we're all here for convention, we're gonna consecrate. Claggett is the only consecration that Seabury ever participated in. So, anyway, Seabury died 1794, and it is through Claggett's consecration that we have the Scottish strain and the English strain joined together in the House of Bishops.
So he did all that work and only ever consecrated one person.
Right. He did all of that and only ever consecrated one. Anyway, next week, we're going to move on to duels.
Nope.
2 weeks. Sorry, I keep saying that. 2 weeks from now, we're going to move on to duels and all of the fun part of trying to be Episcopalians in a young country that is really, law and order is not necessarily one of its high points.
Why 2 weeks?
Next week is the annual meeting, so there are no classes next week. Okay? One service at noon. No. 9. On that note, I'm going to go shut up. Okay?